It is Easter, and we're hearing a lot about forgiveness. So why don't we take a look at the concept of forgiveness from a psychologist's point of view? Why does it matter, and what gets in the way? Are there some things we shouldn't forgive? Dr. Rachel Hannam is a psychologist at North Brisbane Psychologists. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Ashwin. How are you?
I'm well tonight. How does a psychologist define this religious-sounding idea of forgiveness?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Easter does have themes of repentance and forgiveness in the face of betrayal and cruelty, and these are themes that we definitely deal with as psychologists in the therapy room. You know, a lot of our clients have come to us because they've lost trust or safety or just a sense of who they are and how they're seen by others. And they're angry or they're in grief, and the anger and grief, feed upon each other, and they're suffering. And, you know, sometimes forgiveness is the cure, and we may not talk a lot of, use the word forgiveness a lot, but the psychology of forgiveness is really interesting because, sometimes I say that forgiveness is about giving up hope for a better past, and we get stuck in our heads thinking who was right and who was wrong and if only and what if, and, that sort of rumination can lead to despair and depression, and we do need to find ways to release emotions and let go and stop harbouring resentment.
Why is it so hard to forgive?
Yeah, well, it's because we've been wounded, or betrayed in some way. And this is the theme of, the Easter story in Christianity, is this betrayal and this woundedness. It could be something relatively minor. We might be sidelined at work or criticised harshly or overlooked for an opportunity, and our ego has been wounded. And it's not easy for human beings we take things very personally. But we can learn to develop self-worth that's less reliant on other people's behaviour and not take things so personally. We can, begin to see that we can't control other people's behaviour, and that our angry thoughts don't really protect us or sustain us in the end. And so there's some work to be done on letting go of ego sometimes.
Yes. We're such complex beings. Sometimes I find myself getting angry at people that I now have a good relationship with, but just the earliest smite comes back from maybe 10 years ago, and it seems to fire up that neural network, that old injustice. Is it the case that you can forgive someone but still get angry a bit later because you're just neurally triggered some way?
I think so. I mean, those neural pathways that we developed when we were wounded or betrayed in some way, they're still in there somewhere, and we can relapse and regress into those enemy images, as I call them, those judgments, of who was in the wrong and who was in the right, and, who should have done what. It's very easy to slip back into those stories, and it's quite a bit more effort, but in the end it's easier to bypass the judging mind, stop intellectualizing everything, and look at the underlying feelings and needs that are in you, that are your responsibility, and and let go of some of those old stories to find some freedom from that suffering.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, why would we want to forgive? You've just mentioned freedom from suffering. Is that it, or can you expand on this benefit?
Yeah, I mean, forgiveness helps us close that wound. We can keep opening the wound, like you were saying before, through going back into our story of blame and resentment, bitterness, or even self-pity, which is very easy if we're honest with ourselves. I've done it. We all do it. But there's a saying in Buddhism that holding on to resentment's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. In the end, we have to give up our illusions that will teach the other person a lesson, or somehow they'll change their ways if we hold on to anger and resentment. It doesn't work that way. Forgiveness is for ourselves.
So if our habit is to just remember old slights and stories, you said don't focus on the stories and who was to blame and who wasn't to blame, but focus on something a bit more mature. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem is that the other person who we're angry with, takes up a lot of real estate in our mind. So if we withdraw our attention from that person and return our attention to ourselves, put the attention from the past back into the present moment, and the people we love and what we love doing, finding, meaning. And I'd say giving up the illusion that we're going to change the other person's mind or behaviours. And, self-care, self-care, self-care. We need to come back to focusing on ourselves. And this is a process. Forgiveness doesn't happen in a single moment in time, like switching off a tap. There's a real process involved here.
Tell us more about that process. You said self-care. What is the process of forgiveness that a psychologist would teach?
Yeah, well, there's probably many ways, like a lot of things in life. Sometimes I meet clients and they're just in the early stages where waiting is a crucial part of it. They're not sure if they're ready to forgive, because sometimes the betrayals are minor, like I said, but sometimes they're very deep, like when we're a victim of crime or we were abused as a child. So sometimes, there's a long journey here, and if you don't wanting to forgive is a very important part of forgiveness. But if you're not ready or you don't want to, let that be okay. Just trust that your vision will shift and expand with time, and all you might need to do is step back and just incubate the events that have happened, let them settle down in your mind, and you will work through what matters most. Eventually, we all come to see that holding on to anger and hatred and resentment only hurts ourselves in the end. So there's a couple of practices. Sometimes just waiting for it to happen can be all as good as it gets. But there are some practices. There's something called a loving kindness meditation, which is from Buddhism, but modern psychology uses this quite a lot. This is where you extend loving kindness in your mind to people you love a lot, then to people who are neutral, and then in the final step to people who you harbour resentment towards. You can Google loving kindness meditation. And that might give way to compassion. Compassion means that I eventually see myself in the person who's betrayed me. It's a very hard practice, to imagine the other person struggling and actually bringing compassion towards them. But we're all capable of fear and aggression. So, this difficult practice of seeing the other person in myself, this compassion, it's hard, but it's harder in the long run to hold on to that blame. And another thing I always do with clients is get them to embrace and talk about the feelings that are underneath their anger instead of trying to escape from them. Understand the unmet needs behind the pain and embrace those so that they can process grief and disappointment and these sort of vulnerable feelings that sit underneath the anger.
Is there a balance between processing the feelings and ruminating on them for too long?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're sitting with your feelings and letting yourself feel them and being aware of the temptation to go back into your thinking mind, into blame, into judgment, then you aren't really processing your feelings. You're ruminating on the story. So it's not easy to do. And this is where I think having a good therapist or a trusted friend and staying with those feelings, and you are doing that because it takes you to the unmet needs. We all want love and respect and acknowledgement and tolerance and these kinds of things, support. And when we don't get them, we can feel very betrayed, when we're not safe, when we're not respected. So when we can sit with our feelings and understand what they're about, that's not ruminating, that's processing. But yes, it is a fine line.
What about self-forgiveness? What should we know about that?
Yeah, well, anger and blame turned inward can actually lead to guilt and shame. So when we're very angry and judgmental towards ourselves, we can feel very guilty and ashamed. And so there's room here very much so for self-empathy and self-compassion and letting go of guilt and shame in order to reconcile with ourselves, in order to heal from the pain, that we might have caused ourselves by acting in ways that we're not proud of.
Rachel, we normally have, a lot of people have been having church ministers and pastors on to talk about forgiveness. I thought it'd be really interesting to talk to you as a psychologist. We've spoken many times on different topics. Can I leave a last message with you on forgiveness for the listeners?
Yeah, look, forgiveness is an inside job. Nobody else except you will know if you've made your peace with the situation or achieved true acceptance. But consider practicing forgiveness. It's for yourself, not for the other person.
Rachel Hannam, thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks, Ashwin.